Doctors of Reddit, what's your I don't know how you're alive but we better treat you right now cases? In med school got to scrubbing on a case that bypassed the emergency room and went straight to the OR. Older woman had pointed a shotgun right in the middle of her chest and aimed it down and to the left. The entry hole was a perfect, neat, little coin-sized opening. On the other side of her was absolute shredded carnage where most of her left rib cage was shattered, left lung gone, and you could still see her heart somehow still beating. She was overall stable under anesthesia and oxygen. But holy shit. The surgeons worked 4 hours and got her put back together as best as they could with whatever she had remaining. And one of them said she's going to hurt like a motherfucker. And she's still going to wish she was dead. You're gonna wish you were dead, doctor, to his suicidal patient. When I was in med school we were shown a patient who had both lungs fully collapsed. Yet he came into the hospital all by himself and was only complaining about it being slightly difficult to breathe. I've had both my lungs collapse but not at the same time. It only hurt when it first happened, then I just had a mild pain when I took a really big deep breath. Never had any trouble breathing. Didn't hurt if I wasn't taking deep breaths. First time it ever happened I ignored it for a whole week until I nearly passed out randomly and thought, yeah, I need to see a doctor. Not a doctor, but I fell off of a trailer and landed on my head and they rushed me to the hospital. The doctors did some x-rays and a CT scan and sent me home. 12 days later I go to the orthopedic and I tell him my symptoms. Does a quick exam and takes x-rays of my neck. Come to find out that I fractured and dislocated 2 vertebrae in my neck, C6 and C7, and tore all the ligaments in my neck. Right before I left to go to the ER he said, "Welcome to your second life. You should be paralyzed from the neck down at best. How the hell did they miss that the first time?" I had a cousin that survived 2 weeks with a ruptured appendix, and the doctors at the time said if they hadn't seen it beforehand they would have said your chances of surviving that were pretty much zero. He was in hospital quite some time after the surgery, but he ended up being just fine. Man, I thought you'd die from sepsis or something like in a few days from that. I mean, isn't it literally your stomach juices leaking into your abdominal cavity? That's insane. How did he survive the pain even? As a med student, I saw an asymptomatic diabetic patient with a blood glucose level so high our portable glucometers couldn't quantify it. When I did a blood draw, students do procedures here, I noticed that the plasma looked pretty syrup-y. Hyperglycemic hyperosmolar state is a very dangerous condition that usually leads to mental obtundation and neurologic deficits, yet this guy was sitting and chatting with everyone who came to monitor him, without so much as a headache. Christ, when your blood is Caro syrup with some bits of rust in it and you're totally functional, the F was he. Stay Puft Marshmallow Man? Not a doctor, but a patient. I was in a bad car accident in high school where I went off a 38-foot drop. I was conscious and got out of the wreck. The ambulance picked me up and noticed my blood pressure wasn't reading correctly and had trouble finding a pulse. But they didn't seem too worried as I was talking and awake. We get to the ER and again they are struggling to find a stable pulse. They continue to try to figure it out while they start stitching up the wound on my head and I just passed out. Turns out, I was probably bleeding in the car a lot longer than I realized and had lost over 30% of my blood volume. The paramedics didn't realize how much I had bled because the car landed in a way that almost none of it ended up on me. The car was on standing completely vertical on its front, and I didn't seem confused or show other signs of hypovolemic shock. The hospital gave me a plasma transfusion and fortunately everything turned out okay. But the doctor told me it was a lot closer to turning out bad than I realized. Later that week, we went to get my stuff out of the car and the entire hood and most of the dashboard were just covered in blood. My mom just broke down in tears and couldn't go near the car. It was crazy. He didn't damage the guardrails, and since this was before cell phones were invented, so no one knew he did it. Well, he was pinned in his car not to hurt, but sure as hell attracted a lot of mosquitoes. So he sat there all night getting eaten alive by mosquitoes till morning when they found him. My dad said they counted estimated over 10,000 mosquito bites and lived. He lost both of his legs too, I think. Not a doctor but can contribute somewhat. I had an emergency appointment with my GP after I'd been suffering from lightheadedness and exhaustion for about 2 weeks. He took my blood pressure which came to 65/40 and he was shocked I hadn't yet been admitted to hospital as my BP was dangerously low. After going to hospital it turns out I have Addison's disease and am one of around 8,500 in my country with it. I had the opposite BP scenario recently. We already have high BP in my family, and for years, doctors had been telling me that my, apparently, dangerously high, BP of 160/115 not great, but not an emergency, or something similar. It always had the tone like you're like 10 pounds overweight. Maybe cut back on the beer for a little bit. Fast forward to a few months ago, I broke my hand and went to the ER. The triage nurse took my BP like 3 times, and then I overhear this conversation. Entry clerk, that's not right. Take it again. Triage nurse, I took it 3 times. Entry clerk supervises the 4th time they take my BP, then waves her hand in front of me and says, "Can you see me?" "Yeah, I see you fine. Can we take a look at my broken hand now?" "We're not admitting you for a broken hand. You're here on a stroke watch now." Apparently my BP was 204/140. Not a doctor, but when I was 4, doctors discovered I have been living with celiac disease and diabetes mellitus, so type 1, not type 2, since I was born. At that time I was a lot shorter than everyone else my age because I couldn't grow. They tested my blood sugar and it turned out I had a blood sugar of 67.8 mol, which is 7 times more than what is normal and 3 times what you need to faint, and about 13.0 mol over what you need to be pronounced in critical condition. I could have died at any moment. Doctors said I was a 1 in a million. I'm 17 now and everything is going great. Did you grow in height? I am a medical resident on my ICU rotation last year. We were looking after a patient who had undergone seemingly uneventful open heart surgery. Over the next several days, he developed an infection, which is not uncommon. People get pneumonia after anesthesia. The skin around the surgical site can become infected, etc. Weirdly though, he seemed to be getting worse despite aggressive antibiotic treatment. Somewhere around the 5th day, it is time to take the drainage tube out of his chest. They are placed there after every surgery like this so that blood does not accumulate around the heart, and lo and behold, literal feces start pouring out of this poor man's chest cavity. Turns out the cardiothoracic surgeon had punctured the man's intestine with the tube on the way up to his heart, essentially creating a highway for his colonic microorganisms. Ended up with multiple bacteria and fungi running rampant in his chest, abdomen, and bloodstream. Obviously needed repeat surgery to get everything cleaned out. Somehow survived, in the short term at least, despite being pretty sick to begin with. I'll never forget looking at that CT scan though. Horrifying stuff. Nurse, get the charm in. Stat. My mom went 2 years without managing her type 1 diabetes. She finally went in for a checkup. I felt like shit after a couple days. How TF does anyone go 2 years? Had a little pain in my knee. Thought it was a pulled muscle. Kinda felt like it needed to pop. Tried to get it to pop by kicking my foot out twice. Didn't pop, so I figured I'd go sit down and massage it. Took a step and got dizzy with a little tunnel vision and hearing impairment. Went to the hospital and walked in. Mentioned I thought it was a blood clot. Previous job as EMT. So they took me back. I laughed and joked the whole way. Poked fun at a nurse for blowing a vein in my left arm. Did a chest CT and they found a fairly large saddle pulmonary embolism. Doctor mentioned that I shouldn't have been awake with the percentage of blockage I had, let alone walking in and being my jovial self. Got me meds and gave me a nice suite for a weekend. I'm now on blood thinners for life and damn are they expensive. I'm sorry for the expensive living. My mum has back surgery and a few days later became extremely ill. She called over 12-year-old me and confided I may die. Jesus. So they get her into a room and they have no idea what her symptoms are caused by. They decide it may be a plague. So we have to gown up, gloves, mask, the whole thing just to see her. It was awful, and they couldn't fix it. They didn't know why. And then a student doc looked over her chart for funsies and said she just had back surgery. This aligns with a spinal fluid leak. So they get her in, and realize it's so significant that they could have lose her in 48 hours. She good now. Jesus. That's one hell of an oversight. I'm glad she's okay, but oh my god, if not for that student, that kid deserves one hell of a hug. .84 back of someone I know led the doctors to say they had never actually seen one that high. Sent her home 8 hours later, still sheet-faced. That's ridiculously high and dangerous. An acquaintance in my circle was Baker acted and they measured her at .48 back. Gave her husband and friends the admonishment that at that level she was effectively killing herself. I was accidentally shot pretty bad. Femoral artery was destroyed in my right leg. Doctors told my parents and the ICU that I had a 0.7% chance of living. 3 years later and I'm not dead yet. My leg, no blood and guts. Not a doctor, but worked in the X-ray department back then. So they brought someone up from ER, still on the stretcher, and they being the paramedics. Both is quite unusual. The guy they brought was a junkie, high on whatever, and had tried to embrace a truck. Maybe he should have chosen a parking truck. But he had not been that smart. He had broken about every bone one can break without dying on the spot. On his X-ray request form nearly everything was ticked, and he still hadn't recognized that he had a problem, or at least not the vital details. The paramedics, one X-ray person, and me, non-medical bureaucrat, were put in lead shirts and assigned to hold him down. He actually kicked and punched at the people around him with broken legs and arms. That's an interesting story, but I have to say your style of writing is exhausting to read. 35 plus years ago, my dad, age 53, a farmer, never any health insurance, developed pain in his gut, always had a touchy stomach, nerves, stress, food. It was bad enough this time, or different enough, that he finally went to the doctor, little country clinic says, HMMMM. And sent him to the nearby hospital to get a scan X-ray. It was a day or two after that long to read scans back then. They called him and said, "Get to the hospital now, your appendix has burst." Just he and I at home. I was 13, so he drove himself to the hospital. He recovered, but it was a tough surgery and it was probably hours from being too late. The surgeon said the appendix had partially burst, then had tried to heal itself. Fast forward 30 years. My sister, age 53, developed stomach pains. She suffers with it for a night and finally tells my mom maybe she should go to the hospital. Her appendix had burst. It was hours from being too late. I've got less than 3 years before my appendix expires, it seems. Is it possible that it's a problem that develops over time before it becomes painful? Not a doctor, but I heard a story about a guy who got shot in the forehead with a nail gun. Scared the living shit out of the guy who shot him with it. Calmly climbed down the ladder he was on to take care of the guy who shot him. The guy had fainted and fallen off of the building they were working on. Drove this guy to the hospital to get his friend checked out. Anyway, he pulls up to the hospital with everyone staring at him. And he's saying things like, "Oh, are you okay?" He took his friend to a doctor and the doctor stared blankly at him and grabbed a mirror. Showed the guy his forehead with a 1.5-inch nail stuck in it and the guy immediately passed out. The doctors treated him and he was fine. But damn, that's crazy. Not a doctor, but I was in a car accident with my friend. Car going over 240 km per hour. We hit the IDK. What came as I was sitting on seat with my legs on the seat as well and looking for something at the back. Friend died on spot. Body recovered in 3 pieces. I, however, was found 54 feet from the place. Bystanders told my parents that I was fine and got up, cleaned my clothes, checked the blood on my face and collapsed. And I had no clue this happened. The ER didn't panic because of that statement. Turned out I had 46 broken bones, and ruptured lung and a dislocated shoulder. Still alive and kicking. What the fuck? The question of this post is how I always imagine my next doctor visit. Late to the party, but why not? I am a doctor, abdomen, and pelvis. His history is difficulty swallowing and not very hungry. I read the studies and I have never seen so much cancer in any one patient in my entire career. His liver was entirely replaced with cancer. His spleen was a single large met and one of his kidneys was completely destroyed. He has diffuse carcinomatosis throughout his abdomen with massive ascites and every lymph node was abnormal and enlarged. A CT of his neck showed huge lymph nodes and an MR of his brain revealed at least 8 separate metastases. Apparently, when he was 16, about 9 years prior, his mom took him to the doctor where they removed a skin lesion that turned out to be melanoma. He was referred for follow-up, but mom decided they were too busy. Skip ahead to today. The guy is still around and his tumors are shrinking a bit. He's doing okay, mostly comfortable, and hanging in there. Mom is a basket case, and he's only 25? Jesus. I had someone come in complaining of having a cold. Their blood sugar level was eventually tested, and came back as above 400. In most people high 200s. You feel sick. 300 you start to pass out or feel like you need a hospital. They left us in an ambulance. This is my grandmother, she's diabetic, and for the first couple days after she had a surgery on her foot it was reading almost 400. I felt like a real piece of sh because I didn't realize what that meant initially. She's fine now, but when I looked up normal blood sugar I almost had a heart attack.